The gate agent's voice cut sharply through the noise of the busy terminal. VIP passengers only. Sir, you'll need to wait your turn. The elderly man in the worn leather jacket didn't protest or complain. Instead, he stepped aside with the quiet grace of someone used to being invisible, settling into an empty seat in the corner where he could watch the world rush past. His hands, weathered and steady, clutched a small canvas bag that had traveled more miles than most people could dream of. Around him, sleek business executives and first-class passengers moved with confident purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the floor, marking them as the privileged few whose time was deemed more valuable. But from the cockpit window, a pair of eyes suddenly widened in disbelief. The pilot's clipboard slipped and crashed to the floor as recognition struck like a bolt of lightning. 37 years of memories flooded back in an instant, erasing the years in a heartbeat. Without a word to his confused co-pilot, Captain Torres was already making his way toward the jet bridge door. What he was about to do would stop an entire departure gate and remind everyone that true greatness often wears the most humble disguise. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected places. Before we dive into this incredible story about gratitude, respect, and the teachers who shape our lives forever, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this about human dignity and recognition deserve to be shared with the world, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Your support helps us bring these powerful moments of humanity to light. Gate 17 at Denver International Airport hummed with the familiar energy of a Thursday morning departure. Flight 2847 to Miami was running slightly behind schedule, which meant that the usual hierarchy of air travel was being enforced with even more rigid precision than normal. The gate area was divided into invisible but clearly understood zones. Premium passengers clustered near the boarding door with their priority access clearly displayed. Business travelers occupied the middle territory with their laptops and phone calls. And everyone else waited in the general seating area, resigned to their place in the pecking order. Frank Castellano sat in the far corner of the waiting area, as far from the boarding chaos as possible. At 74, he had learned that airports were easier to navigate when you made yourself invisible, when you avoided the rush and crush of impatient travelers who saw elderly passengers as obstacles rather than people. His appearance did nothing to contradict their assumptions. His leather flight jacket was older than some of the passengers waiting to board, his jeans were clean but worn. And his canvas travel bag looked like it had been purchased sometime during the Reagan administration. The gate agent, a young woman named Patricia who had been working for the airline for 18 months, barely glanced at Frank as she processed the boarding passes of passengers who clearly belonged to higher status categories. She had been trained to recognize the signs of importance: expensive luggage, premium cabin tickets, frequent flyer status levels that commanded automatic respect and attention. Frank possessed none of these markers, so he remained effectively invisible to her professional radar. What Patricia couldn't see, what none of the bustling passengers around Frank could see, was the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Its pages contained hundreds of names, each one representing a life he had touched during his 42 years as a flight instructor. Names like Rodriguez, Chin, Thompson, Williams, pilots who had gone on to command aircraft for major airlines, who had safely transported millions of passengers around the world, who had handled emergencies with skill and precision that could be traced directly back to lessons learned in Frank's classroom and cockpit. The notebook also contained letters, creased and worn from repeated reading, thank you notes from pilots who had successfully handled engine failures, weather emergencies, and mechanical problems using procedures Frank had drilled into them during their training. Letters from airlines commending Frank for producing pilots who demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure. Most precious of all, letters from passengers who had no idea who Frank was, but whose lives had been saved by pilots he had trained. Frank's career in aviation had begun in 1962, when flying was still considered a dangerous profession and pilot training was as much about building character as it was about teaching technical skills. He had learned to fly an aircraft that required physical strength to control, in an era when instrument flying was an art form rather than a computer-assisted procedure, when pilots needed to understand not just how to operate their aircraft, but how to think their way through problems that had never been encountered before. Over the decades, Frank had adapted to new technology, new procedures, and new regulations, but his core philosophy had never changed. He believed that flying was fundamentally about responsibility to passengers who trusted their lives to the skill and judgment of their pilots, responsibility to fellow crew members who depended on each other for safety, and responsibility to the profession itself to maintain the highest standards of competence and integrity. The aviation industry had changed dramatically during Frank's career. Aircraft had become safer, more reliable, and more automated. Training programs had become more standardized and technologically sophisticated. But Frank had always insisted that the human element remained the most critical factor in aviation safety. Computers could fly aircraft with precision that exceeded human capability, but only humans could make the kind of instantaneous decisions required when everything went wrong simultaneously. As the boarding process continued, Frank watched the familiar ritual with the detached interest of someone who had seen it thousands of times before. The announcement of priority boarding brought a rush of passengers to the gate, each clutching boarding passes that granted them various levels of privilege and access. First-class passengers swept past with the confidence of people accustomed to preferential treatment. Business-class travelers followed with the slightly anxious energy of people who had paid for comfort but weren't quite sure they belonged in the premium categories. Patricia worked efficiently through the queue, scanning boarding passes and directing passengers down the jet bridge with the mechanical precision of someone who had processed thousands of travelers without really seeing any of them as individuals. Her training had taught her to move people through the system quickly and efficiently, to minimize delays and avoid complications that might disrupt the carefully choreographed dance of commercial aviation. When the announcement came for general boarding, Frank rose slowly from his seat and joined a line that had formed at the gate. He moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body bore the accumulated wear of decades of physical work, but his posture retained the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent his career in positions of authority and responsibility. The passengers around Frank in line represented the full spectrum of humanity that passes through airports every day. A young mother struggled with a crying infant and an overloaded diaper bag. A businessman checked his phone constantly, clearly stressed about meetings and connections that depended on arriving on time. A group of college students returning from spring break chatted excitedly about their adventures, their voices carrying the careless confidence of youth. None of them paid any attention to Frank. He was just another elderly passenger moving slowly through the system, probably visiting grandchildren or attending a medical appointment. His presence didn't register as significant or noteworthy. He was part of the background, the kind of passenger that airlines processed efficiently but didn't really notice. Patricia glanced at Frank's boarding pass when he reached the gate, noted his zone number and seat assignment, and waved him through without making eye contact. He was traveling in coach, had no special status with the airline, and represented exactly the kind of passenger who required no special attention or consideration. Her interaction with him lasted approximately 3 seconds and left no impression on her memory. As Frank made his way down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, he passed through a space that connected the terminal to the plane, a transitional zone where passengers moved from the world of ground transportation to the realm of flight. For most travelers, this passage was simply a necessary step in getting from one place to another. For Frank, it was a reminder of the miracle of aviation that still amazed him after more than 5 decades in the industry. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 737, one of the most common commercial aircraft in the world, a workhorse of the airline industry that represented decades of engineering innovation and safety improvements. Frank automatically noted details that other passengers missed: the condition of the aircraft exterior, the professionalism of the ground crew, the efficiency of the boarding process. His trained eye caught small details that spoke to the overall safety culture of the airline and the competence of its operations. But what Frank couldn't see, what he had no way of knowing, was that the captain of Flight 2847 was at that very moment conducting his pre-flight walk-around inspection of the aircraft. Captain Miguel Torres was following the same systematic procedure that Frank had taught him 37 years earlier, checking control surfaces, inspecting tires, and verifying that every external component of the aircraft was properly secured and functioning. Captain Torres completed his external inspection and was heading back toward the aircraft when movement in the gate area caught his eye. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that separated the terminal from the tarmac, he could see passengers still boarding the flight, and something about one particular figure made him pause and look more carefully. The man was elderly, moving slowly but with obvious purpose, carrying a bag that looked familiar in a way that tugged at Miguel's memory. But it was the posture, the way the man held his head, the particular combination of authority and humility in his bearing that triggered a cascade of recognition that hit Miguel like a physical blow. Frank Castellano, the instructor who had taken a terrified 22-year-old kid from East LA, and somehow convinced him that he could master the complex art of flying commercial aircraft. The man who had spent countless hours in cockpit simulators, creating emergency scenarios that pushed young pilots to their limits, forcing them to develop the kind of split-second decision-making skills that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone aboard an aircraft. Miguel's mind flooded with memories that had shaped his entire approach to flying. Frank's voice in the simulator, calm and patient even when his students were making mistakes that could have been catastrophic in real flight. Frank's insistence that every procedure be executed with precision, that every checklist item be completed thoroughly, that every decision be made with the safety of passengers as the primary consideration. The training had been rigorous, demanding, and sometimes intimidating. Frank had created simulator scenarios that seemed designed to break down his students' confidence, to find the limits of their competence and push them beyond what they thought they could handle. Engine failures during critical phases of flight. Severe weather that required split-second navigation decisions. Medical emergencies that demanded immediate action while maintaining aircraft control. But Frank's teaching had gone far beyond technical skills. He had taught Miguel and his fellow students that flying was fundamentally about character, about the kind of person you became when everything went wrong and people's lives depended on your judgment. He had emphasized that the responsibility of command meant never compromising safety for convenience, never cutting corners to save time, and never forgetting that every passenger represented someone's family, someone's future, someone's dreams. Miguel remembered one particular training session when Frank had created a scenario involving multiple system failures during approach to landing in severe weather conditions. Miguel had failed the simulation repeatedly, becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to manage the cascading emergencies. After the third failed attempt, Frank had pulled him aside for a conversation that had fundamentally shaped Miguel's understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. "Miguel," Frank had said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "you're trying to be perfect, and perfect pilots don't exist. What you need to be is prepared. When everything goes wrong, and someday it will, you need to have trained yourself to think clearly, communicate effectively, and make decisions that prioritize the safety of every person on your aircraft. That's not something you learn from a manual. That's something you develop through practice, through failure, through pushing yourself beyond what you think you can handle." The lesson had proven invaluable just 2 years later when Miguel faced his first real emergency as a commercial pilot. A hydraulic failure that left him with limited control authority and no normal braking capability. The procedures Frank had drilled into him, the decision-making framework he had taught, and the calm approach to crisis management he had modeled had enabled Miguel to bring 156 passengers safely to the ground in what investigators later called a textbook example of emergency piloting. Miguel had tried to find Frank after that incident, to thank him for training that had quite literally saved lives. But Frank had already moved on to another airline's training program, and their paths had never crossed again. Miguel had carried Frank's lessons with him throughout his career, had taught them to first officers under his command, and had credited Frank's instruction with giving him the skills and confidence to handle whatever challenges arose in the cockpit. Now, seeing his former instructor boarding his aircraft as just another passenger, Miguel felt a profound sense of injustice mixed with overwhelming gratitude. Without hesitation, he abandoned his pre-flight preparations and headed for the gate. Miguel's appearance in the gate area caused immediate confusion among the passengers and airline staff. Captains didn't typically leave their aircraft during boarding unless there was a serious problem, and his urgent stride toward the boarding area suggested that something significant was happening. Patricia looked up from her computer terminal with alarm as the uniformed captain approached her station. Her first thought was that there was a mechanical problem that would delay or cancel the flight, the kind of operational crisis that would require her to manage angry passengers and rebooking requests. But Miguel's attention was focused entirely on the elderly man who was just disappearing down the jetridge. "Excuse me," he said to Patricia, his voice carrying an urgency that made her immediately attentive. "The gentleman who just boarded, the older man with the canvas bag. I need to speak with him immediately." Patricia's confusion deepened. "Sir, is there a problem? Is he on some kind of security list?" Miguel shook his head, already moving toward the jetridge. "No problem. Just the opposite. That man is the reason I know how to fly." The statement made no sense to Patricia, but Miguel was already heading down the jet bridge with the kind of determined purpose that suggested this was not the time for questions or explanations. She watched through the window as the captain entered the aircraft, wondering what kind of situation could require such urgent personal intervention. Inside the aircraft, Miguel quickly located Frank, who had settled into his assigned seat in row 23 and was quietly reading a paperback novel. The sight of his former instructor sitting in a cramped coach seat, treated as just another anonymous passenger, filled Miguel with a determination to correct what felt like a fundamental injustice. "Frank Castellano," Miguel said, his voice carrying across the cabin with enough authority to make nearby passengers look up with curiosity. "Sir, would you please come with me?" Frank looked up from his book, his weathered face showing surprise and then growing recognition as he processed the face of the uniformed captain standing in the aisle. The years had changed Miguel from a nervous young student into a confident airline captain, but his eyes still held the same intensity and intelligence that Frank remembered from their training sessions decades earlier. "Miguel Torres," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the warmth of a teacher seeing a former student who had exceeded all expectations. "Captain Torres now. I see. I always knew you'd make an excellent pilot." Miguel's response carried 37 years of gratitude that had been waiting for the right moment to be expressed. "Sir, everything I know about flying, I learned from you. Every safe flight I've ever commanded, every emergency I've handled, every passenger I've brought home safely, it's all because of what you taught me." The conversation had attracted the attention of passengers throughout the aircraft, and Miguel realized that this moment was about more than just personal gratitude. It was about recognition, about honoring someone whose contributions to aviation safety had touched thousands of lives, about ensuring that heroism and dedication were acknowledged rather than overlooked. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miguel announced, his voice carrying the authority of command but also the humility of a student honoring his teacher, "I want you to meet Captain Frank Castellano, one of the finest flight instructors in aviation history. For over 40 years, he trained pilots like me to handle emergency situations, to make decisions under pressure, and to prioritize the safety of every person aboard our aircraft." The impact of Miguel's words rippled through the cabin like a revelation. Passengers who had been absorbed in their phones and magazines looked up with new interest. The young mother with the crying infant realized she was sitting near someone whose students had safely transported millions of families. The stressed businessman understood that his ability to travel safely for work depended on training programs that people like Frank had developed and implemented. Miguel continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "Captain Castellano taught me that flying isn't just about following procedures. It's about understanding that every passenger represents someone's family, someone's future, someone's dreams. He taught me that the responsibility of command means never compromising safety for convenience, and never forgetting that people's lives depend on our judgment and skill." As Miguel spoke, Frank rose from his coach seat with the same dignity he had maintained throughout his career. He wasn't seeking attention or recognition. That had never been his way. But he understood that this moment meant something important to Miguel, and that accepting his former student's gratitude was as much about honoring the relationship between teacher and student as it was about personal acknowledgement. Miguel gently took Frank's arm and began walking toward the front of the aircraft. "Sir, I'd like you to join me in the cockpit for this flight. It would be an honor to have you there." The walk from row 23 to the cockpit became a journey of recognition and respect. Passengers who had initially seen Frank as just another elderly traveler now understood that they were in the presence of someone whose knowledge and dedication had quite literally saved lives. The man they had overlooked was actually one of the people responsible for the safety of commercial aviation, someone whose training methods had prepared thousands of pilots for the emergencies that could determine whether passengers lived or died. As they reached the cockpit, Miguel introduced Frank to his first officer, Sarah Chin, who immediately recognized Frank's name from her own training experiences. The aviation industry was small enough that legendary instructors like Frank were known throughout the profession, their reputations built on decades of producing pilots who demonstrated exceptional skill under pressure. The cockpit of the Boeing 737 had changed significantly since Frank's active training days, with new technology, updated displays, and advanced systems that hadn't existed when he was teaching young pilots. But the fundamental principles of aviation safety, the importance of clear communication, systematic problem-solving, and calm decision-making under pressure, these remained exactly as Frank had taught them. During the flight to Miami, Frank shared stories from his 4 decades of training pilots, describing changes in the industry, improvements in safety procedures, and the evolution of training methods. Miguel and Sarah listened with the respect and attention that every student owes to a master teacher, understanding that they were receiving insights from someone whose experience spanned the entire modern era of commercial aviation. Frank also learned about developments in aviation that had occurred since his retirement, new safety technologies, updated training programs, and improved procedures that had made flying even safer than it had been during his active career. The conversation was a bridge between generations of aviators, connecting the wisdom of experience with the innovation of progress. As they approached Miami, Miguel asked Frank if he would like to observe the landing from the cockpit jump seat. Frank accepted the invitation with quiet pleasure, understanding that this was an honor that recognized not just his individual expertise, but the importance of the teaching profession in aviation safety. The landing was smooth and precise, executed with the kind of professional competence that Frank had spent his career trying to instill in young pilots. As the aircraft rolled to the gate, Miguel turned to his former instructor with gratitude that had been waiting decades to be properly expressed. "Captain Castellano, I need you to know that your training has been with me on every flight I've ever commanded. The procedures you taught me, the decision-making framework you instilled, the understanding of responsibility you conveyed, they've guided everything I've done as a pilot. I'm a better captain because of what you taught me, and every passenger I've ever carried has been safer because of your instruction." Frank's response was characteristic of the humility that had marked his entire career. "Miguel, you were always going to be an excellent pilot. I just helped you discover what was already there. That's what teaching is, helping people find their own potential and giving them the tools to exceed what they thought they could achieve." As passengers deplaned in Miami, many stopped to thank Frank for his service to aviation and to express appreciation for learning about his role in pilot training. Patricia, the gate agent who had processed his boarding pass without a second glance, made a point of apologizing for not recognizing his significance and thanking him for his decades of service to passenger safety. Frank accepted these expressions of gratitude with the same grace he had shown throughout his career, but Miguel could see that the recognition meant more to him than he would ever admit. In the years since his retirement, Frank had often felt invisible, overlooked by an industry that seemed to value new technology over accumulated wisdom, innovation over experience. The flight from Denver to Miami had reminded Frank that his contributions to aviation safety had not been forgotten, that the thousands of hours he had spent teaching emergency procedures had created a legacy that continued to protect passengers every day. More importantly, it had reminded him that teaching is perhaps the most important profession in any field, the work of passing knowledge, wisdom, and values from one generation to the next. Miguel had learned something equally important. His success as a captain wasn't just the result of his individual talent and effort, it was built on the foundation of teaching and mentorship provided by instructors like Frank Castellano. The recognition he had shown his former teacher wasn't just an act of personal gratitude. It was an acknowledgement of the debt that every professional owes to those who made their achievements possible. In the weeks that followed, Miguel made a point of staying in touch with Frank, inviting him to visit the airline's training facilities and sharing his expertise with new generations of pilots. Frank accepted these invitations with enthusiasm, understanding that his knowledge and experience still had value, that his contributions to aviation safety were ongoing rather than concluded. The gate area where Frank had been told to wait became a symbol of how easily we can overlook the extraordinary people who walk quietly among us. The cockpit invitation that followed became a reminder that respect, recognition, and gratitude should be offered freely to those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. Sometimes the greatest teachers continue teaching long after their formal careers have ended, not through lectures or training sessions, but through the example of dignity, humility, and quiet service they provide in their daily lives. Frank Castellano had taught Miguel Torres how to be a pilot, but on that flight from Denver to Miami, he had taught an entire aircraft full of passengers something equally important about recognizing and honoring the heroes who shape our world. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose teaching, mentorship, or guidance shaped your life in ways you're still discovering? Tell us in the comments about the teachers and mentors who changed your path and how you've honored their contributions to your success. And if you think stories like these about human dignity and gratitude need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.